our first candidate session, and since everybody has been preparing for this, we're going to get started right away. I'm going to read the first question, and the remainder of our questions will be answered by or asked by our participants. The first question it has to do with weak economic growth, and the question is: please state your specific proposal for what should be done about the issue of weak economic growth. Cite data that indicates this proposal is likely to succeed, and explain the trade-offs you considered in recommending this action.
Well, again, thank you all for being here and thank you for participating. When it comes to weak economic growth, the number one factor has to be jobs. If we get jobs, we can change the economic growth of anything. So I think it's extremely important that we look at things that will bring jobs back to the marketplace and the economy. Again, I'm someone who has spent 28 years in the marketplace, created over 1,500 jobs, and has employed over 3,000 people. So I understand what it means to create a job and how we can get these jobs back in the marketplace. As a business owner, no one's going to create a job if there's no certainty and predictability. They have to understand that, what are my taxes going to be? What are my costs of health insurance going to be? What are my costs in the future? As a business owner, you have to have some security as to be able to invest those dollars and add another employee. So those are the key things. I mean, it's very simple. For me, as a business owner, and what I've done over the last 22 months is I've gone out and I've talked to business people. I've talked to those people that employ the individuals, and I've asked them those questions. What would you do today to employ another person? What would you do to bring another person on to your staff or onto the workforce? And they keep saying the same thing. Congressman, until government can fix their own problems and make sure that we have certainty and predictability, we're not going to do anything. It's an interesting answer, but it's the truth, and that's how we get those answers. That's how people in Congress, one thing I don't understand about people in Congress, the answers are pretty simple. They're with the people. You go to the people and you ask them. You go out and you talk to the people and you listen to them. You listen to their concerns and their issues. The big problem in Washington is we send people down there who never have to live within the rules that they make. So it's really important. It's really important that we start listening to the people. The other thing that I think is so important about economic growth and how do you make economic growth is you've got to have people trained. You've got to have people that understand what the job requirements are. We've got to get them back in the workforce. I was happy that this past year, one of the bills that my bipartisan group put together actually got out on the floor, and it's part of the payroll tax extension. What it is that we take unemployment insurance and instead of just paying unemployment insurance, let's train people with it. Let's take that unemployment dollars and put it into training. So if an individual, let's get them back on the workforce by training them with unemployment dollars. And it did pass. It's a waiver program, but it came through this bipartisan group because I'm a firm believer the other way we're going to get things done in Washington, we've got to be able to work together. It's so important that we work as Republicans and Democrats because our problems aren't Democrat issues or Republican issues. You know what they are? They're American issues, and that's how we're going to get the economy rolling again. So for me, economic growth comes to jobs. For every new person we can get on the payroll, for every new person we can get working, they're going to go out and spend money. I look back just 10 years ago, people were willing to spend money because they were comfortable with their house, they were comfortable with the value in it, they were comfortable their paycheck was going to continue. Today, people aren't comfortable their job's going to continue. And that's a real problem for us in today's economy.
Great. Let's go to our first question from the Weak Economic Growth Group. Hillary.
Yes, thank you. What policies have you supported in the last 2 years to promote economic growth, and what were the results of those policies?
Well, it's interesting. We in the House, we've supported a lot of policies. We have over 30 jobs bills out there. Many of them, I'll give you just a simple one. Here's one that just makes so much common sense. One of the bills we passed out of the House said that no new regulation, we're not stripping old regulations away. No new regulation should go forward unless we get unemployment below 6%. Sounds like a pretty simple policy. Now, we passed that out of the House. The Senate has not taken it up. When we talk about economic growth and job policies, we pass bills to get oil exploration going again in the Gulf. I think that's very important. We need to be, if we're going to, look, not only can we get economic growth and jobs, with oil exploration and gas exploration and you know, all of the above. Remember, I'm a firm believer in all of the above, but just think, every time we push for jobs, every time we push for more exploration, we can continue to get jobs. Think about what's going on in Ohio. It's a perfect example. You know, people want to say, well, the policies are working in Ohio. You know what's working in Ohio? We have oil and gas under the ground. That's what's working in Ohio. And everywhere I go, I was just at Caterpillar yesterday. They're saying that their biggest growth is because of the exploration for oil and gas here in Ohio. I was just at a manufacturer, steel manufacturing, who said the same thing. We're starting to boom again. Now, you know why? Oil and gas. We've got to start looking at it. That doesn't mean we can't be environmentally correct. We've got to make sure that we protect the environment at the same time. But let's look at ways to make sure that at the same time we're growing our economy, but also becoming energy efficient and independent.
Hillary, can we go to the next question?
Yes, thank you.
Brenda, can you ask your question?
Yes. What is the process that you personally use to evaluate new proposed policy to determine how you want to vote for that policy or against it?
Well, number one, I read it. I mean, that's got to be the first thing. That's got to be the most important thing. You got to read the bill. I mean, a lot of times these bills come in and nobody even looks at them. They let their staff look at them. I mean, I want to read it, number one. Number two, is it worth the policy? Well, again, I always look back over my business background. Again, what you have in me is a little different than normal because I have 28 years of business experience that I take to Washington. And a lot of times in Washington, people go there and their background is not, you know, it's interesting because, you know, you look at some Congress people and they were staff members of the previous congressperson. So what we really have is we have a process that continues to grow and grow and grow. And what I believe in, we need to be able to take experience that we learned in the private sector and take it to Washington. So I look at those things. I try and compare it to my business background. So when my staff comes in and says, here's a bill, I look at it, and then they turn around and say, here's what I think. I tell them, well, here's what I think. Now let's figure out why you might think different than I think. Because from a business perspective, I'm going to look at things a little bit different than somebody who's just been in policy their whole life. You got to remember, in business you have policy too. And in business you have politics too. But at least in business you come up with a finite answer that works. So I think the key is to look at the proposal and then make decisions. And here's the number one thing: if it costs money, is it worth borrowing money from China to do it? Is it worth, you know, putting more debt on our children and grandchildren? We need to think about that. And number two, has it worked in the past? Are there comparisons? I think that's important. But number three, which I think we lack in Washington, is even after we approve it or vote for it, if it does get approved, let's look back over it. You know, the number one problem in Washington is if you vote for something, you don't want to ever say it's wrong. But let's face it, we all have made mistakes. And I think at some point in time we need to say, that was a mistake, it didn't work, let's not do it again.
Another question, or are you satisfied? Okay. Kevin, can we have your question, please?
Do you believe tax reductions for individuals and/or corporations are effective in stimulating economic growth, and why?
Well, I would tell you this. We have to be competitive. And in this country now, we have to be globally competitive. So if you think about it, if we're at the highest corporate tax rate today at 35%, that's a fact. The highest corporate tax rate, 35%. The next highest is 25%. So if you know that as a fact, and you want to raise taxes, what you're saying is two things. You're going to raise taxes, so you're going to make sure you're going to take us out of being globally competitive, because 25% is the next highest tax rate in the world. Now you got to remember, there's less tax rates, but 25% is the next highest. So if you're going to raise taxes, you're going to say, well, I'm not worried about global competitiveness. Let's face it, we are in a global market. We have to be global competitive. You know, part of my district is Wayne County. There's a lot of farmers in Wayne County. You know what they all say to me? We want to make sure we can export out of this country too. We want to be able to sell our goods out of this country too. They are part of the global marketplace. I bring that as an example because a lot of people don't even realize that the farmers in Wayne County are part of the global marketplace. So we have to be competitive globally. The next thing when it comes to higher taxes, and I'm giving you the reverse and then I'll bring you back. If you raise taxes or you leave them where they're at, what you're doing to the guy, and you got to remember, and this is important, and sometimes it's hard to explain, but not only is the corporate tax rate, small business pay their taxes on their personal tax return. Now, I was a CPA, so it's a lot easier for me to understand. But what happens is you can file your tax return on small businesses, and small businesses actually employ, 60-some% of our workforce. So if you have a small business and you take all your profits and you roll it down to your personal tax return, you're paying taxes on that personal basis too. So you have to be competitive there too. There are a lot of businesses, over 70% of small businesses pay their taxes based on that. So my answer is, I think what we need to do, I'm a firm believer in keeping the tax rates as they are today consistently and moving forward, because that brings
Any follow-up question to clarify that?
Yeah, just to clarify, I was asking about tax reductions, and you kind of did the reverse. So do you not believe that tax reductions are an effective way for either corporations or individuals?
No, that's what I said. I didn't have enough time, but I would tell you yes. I do believe that to be globally competitive, we need to get our tax rates down to 25%. We need to be able to compete. How do we do that and not lose revenue? Is we need to look at deductions. We need to look. We need to reform our tax code. We need to bring tax rates down. So I said the reverse, and I apologize. But yes, we do need to get it. We need to be globally competitive, and then we need to make sure that we put it. When we bring our rates down, we give people certainty and predictability going forward.
Abby, are you ready with your question?
Do you support stimulus or austerity programs or a combination of both and provide a successful example?
Well, first off, we are spending money we don't have. And the problem in Washington is you cannot spend yourself into prosperity. Look, I guarantee you everybody in this room would say the same thing. You're not going to get out of a hole by spending more money. Now, sometimes you can show, if you can show, there is something particular, but that's very tough to do, especially in government, because government isn't involved in the process. If we're going to stimulate our economy, it's the business owners that have to stimulate it. It's the entrepreneurs. It's the people who produce jobs. It's the people who employ people, and it's those hardworking Americans who come out and work in those jobs and continue to buy refrigerators and stoves and all those things. That's what's going to bring the economy back. So the answer is, I'm a firm believer in no stimulus unless you can 100% prove that it's going to have a return, which I think is very doubtful in many cases in Washington. But at the same time, let's get our spending down. We shouldn't spend any money. Every time we look at spending in Washington, we should say to ourselves, are we willing to continue to put this burden on our children and grandchildren? If you think about it, everybody thinks Washington's this thing out there that just has unlimited funds. Keep going after them. And oh, by the way, when you need more, just go get more taxes. That's a problem. I think what we need to do is make sure we understand, that people understand we can't continue to spend money we don't have. And the number one thing we should do is we should look at, is it worth borrowing money from China to do what we're doing? That is so important. That is absolutely so important. Because we can't continue to borrow money from China either.
Satisfied? Great. Ron, can we have your question?
Yes. Good morning, Congressman.
Morning.
We are in a period of little or no growth. What current policies do you feel are working well and which are not?
Well, I think the policies over the last 4 years, let's face it, you got to look at what's going on. Are they working? Again, in the business world, you do something, you analyze it, and then you determine if it's working. Well, the one thing we're not doing very well is we're not bringing certainty and predictability to the marketplace. So any policy that doesn't bring certainty and predictability to the marketplace isn't working. When we have unbridled regulations, we've got problems because people just freeze up. They don't want to do anything. When we have a fiscal cliff coming, which is a horrible situation for all of us coming here in November, that brings no certainty and predictability to the marketplace. So the policies that have been going on, especially the last 2 years that I've been there, but again, I ran because I didn't like the policies of the previous 2 years either. And some of the previous before that. I'm not going to let anybody off the hook, Republicans or Democrats. Republicans spent too much money also. But what I believe in is we need to bring certainty and predictability. We're not doing that right now. This government leaves. We should still be in Washington. We should make sure that we're finishing the job. We should bring certainty and predictability to the marketplace. So I can't really pinpoint policies that are working. Now, we have a lot of bills out there that we've passed that I believe would help, but just have died in the Senate. You know, that's one of the problems today with the uncertainty and predictability. We're passing a lot of bills out of the House. People, you know, you hear the President talk about the Congress that's doing nothing. I don't know, we've passed a lot of bills in the House. They've gone to the Senate. Everybody knows what, you go back to Government 101. House passes a bill, goes to the Senate. The Senate either turns it down, passes it, or mends it and sends it back. Not happening right now. That's a problem. If they don't like what we're doing, send something back. But don't just put it on a shelf, which is one of the problems we have.
Great. We are now going to move into our follow-up question period, which means we can open up questions to the whole group. And our rules for that period are you must ask the question within 1 minute, and the congressman has a minute to respond. So who would like to ask the first follow-up question? Heather.
Okay, what policy do you think will bring certainty and predictability, improving economic growth? Because you said we need predictability.
Right. Long-term tax policy and tax reform will do it. A hold back of more regulations at this point in time. Starting to look at regulations and determining what their economic impact are. We have another bill out there that basically says you don't pass another piece of, you know, the regulators cannot do another regulation until such time as they can determine, especially if it's over $100 million effect to the economy. They have to come back and tell us why. I mean, we represent all of you. Do you want regulators slowing the process down, or do you want them responding to us? That bill, by the way, didn't get any attention in the Senate either. But those are the kind of things that we need to do. Regulations, tax reform, certainty and predictability, moving forward in a position that allows people who employ, you know, our job creators to continue to create jobs. Right now we're not doing that. But those would be the two main things. Regulatory reform and tax reform.
Our next question is from Richard.
Have you considered a tax incentive to consumers for purchasing American manufactured goods, and what was the result?
I think all tax reform needs to be, I think that has to be put on the table as part of tax reform. And I think we need to look at all items when it comes to tax reform. We can't seem to get past the process of doing tax reform. See, in Washington, we talk a lot about it. We talk about tax reform all the time. If you go to my bipartisan group that was formed, we have eight Republicans and 8 Democrats. We have some tax reform out there. It doesn't get looked at, and I think we need to look at it. But part of that, I will give you an idea that we came up with. This was a bipartisan recommendation out of this group that we formed. We said that if countries are producing income overseas, that they should be able to bring back those dollars as long as they reinvest back in American, in their own factory, their own plants, or their own payroll, new payroll. Now there's a tax incentive right there for American jobs, American construction, American growth. And you know, that's one of the things that I was hoping that the bipartisan group was able to get pushed onto the floor. And we'll continue to push.
Our next question. Hillary.
Yes. Is there a way that the government can work more efficiently? And if you believe so, what are your ideas?
Yeah, well, I will tell you this, and I always offer anybody the opportunity to come down and spend a day with me. You want to see one of the most inefficient places, it's there. Number one, nobody starts on time. I mean, they are not going to ever change me of that. You noticed I was here today early. In Washington, you're lucky to get people to show up 5, 10, 15 minutes late, and they think they're early. Efficiency starts by getting there early. You know, I learned that a long time ago. I think that's important. Number two, we need to look at what we're spending. I mean, I can just give you little examples, and you'd say, well, those are little examples. But you know what? You've got to start at the little places. When I first got in the office, I walked into my office. I love the furniture. I love the paint. Now, this may seem minor, but they said, well, you got to change the color of the paint. I go, well, I don't want to change it. I like it. Leave it alone. No, you got to change it. Here's your 3 selections. Talk about inefficiencies. And then they said, I said, well, I like the furniture. No, the furniture's not yours. It's got to move. You got to get the furniture from the guy that, you know, you won the election from, and it's over in another building. Can you imagine that inefficiency in the real world? Can you imagine moving things around like that? It's absolutely ridiculous.
Our next question. Dan?
Congressman Renacci, thank you for coming in this morning and seeing us. My question is that my feeling and my experience, and I am in business as well, We're living in a post-industrial economy. Our economy is changing very rapidly. 50% of our kids coming out of school are looking at no jobs. The efficiencies of the education system are dismal. How, with weak economic growth, would you continue to invest in education and have it be meaningful to the economy that we're trying to grow?
Well, you know, education is really a big issue, and it should be, because we need to be able to train and educate our kids, but we got to make sure there's jobs for them. One of the things I did early on when I first got in office is I had a number of superintendents that I talked to from schools. Again, I always like to go back to the basics. And I said, do you think the federal government should be involved in schools and education? And they go, well, you know what the problem is? How you teach somebody in Ohio is a lot different than how you teach somebody in New Orleans and how you teach somebody in Florida. Because we should set standards, but we also need to know that people learn in different areas, and you've got to be able to adjust for the different areas to bring everybody up. And then you've got to have competition between states. So their thoughts were, which I truly believe, we've got to get all this back on the local levels when it comes to education. It doesn't mean we can't have federal programs that help assist, but we've got to get things back on the local levels. And at the same time, you're right, we've got to get educators, but we've got to have jobs for them. We can educate all we want, but if we don't have jobs, there's nothing for them to go to after they graduate. I'm going to beat that bell.
Slight follow-up, if I may.
Go ahead, Dan.
The other part of that is that these 50% of the kids that don't have jobs have college debts and probably $80,000 to $90,000. The college debt in this country that's underwritten by the government now is larger than our credit card debt. How do we expect the kids to be good consumers and to be part of the economy when they have that kind of a burden that has no tangible result other than a large burden?
Right. Well, look, college debt is an issue, and we talk about that all the time, and it's growing and growing and growing. I think we need to look at our college debt program. I think I always like, again, I love to get back to the basics and talk to people. So I talk to some of the kids who have college debt, and quite frankly, what I'm hearing is sometimes they're not using it in the right direction. I mean, some people are, they're renting apartments and they're buying cars and they're doing all this stuff, and they're running up this college debt, which in my day, and I had college debt, it was based on the education. And then I worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, sometimes 4 jobs to try and supplement that. I mean, so I was a guy who came from a family who couldn't afford college. I had to pay for it myself. I borrowed money. I also worked 3 or 4 jobs, and I worked to get that. So we got to instill that back in them too. But at the same time, we've got to allow those people the opportunity to have that debt to make sure they use it efficiently. And then at the same time, how do we fix all this? Jobs. When they get out, get them the job. But we've got to use the debt efficiently. I think we've lost track of how we use that debt, and that's one of the problems with some of this debt that's growing with college education.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Wanda?
We talked some in our discussions about the government taking on an austerity measure. Do you think anything can be done down in the government to do that?
We should. How many people in this room had austerity programs in the last 8 years, or 6 years? I mean, I did, you did, we all had to. Government doesn't. They think they can continue to spend more money. I was one of the people who passed the balanced budget amendment. Now, it didn't get through. But my goodness, we should have to balance our budget, the federal government. That's the one thing that is so important. We need to be able to balance our budget, and we need to have austerity programs. You can't spend money you don't have. That's the problem with this government, and everybody thinks, well, it'll be taken care of. You know what? Let me tell you a little secret. I used to think that too, probably 10 or 15 years ago, because I was so busy working and I was so busy raising a family that I didn't take the time like all of you are doing to understand things a little better. You ultimately think that there's this government out there, but let's face it, it's not there. We need to make sure there are austerity programs. We get so busy in our lives that we forget this government can actually hurt all of us. And it is. The spending and the debt and the deficit is not only hurting our grandchildren, it's hurting us today, right now.
All right, we have time for one more question. Louise.
Yeah, you talked about job creation. What type of jobs are you talking about?
All jobs. I think we need to make sure that entrepreneurs have the ability to create all kinds of jobs. You're talking about that I've created or that we should create in the future?
In the future.
Yeah, in the future. I think we have to create all kinds of jobs. Look, there are jobs. There should be job opportunities in a lot of areas. This country is changing. We have a global marketplace. So there's going to be jobs in everything from farming to manufacturing. Today, the best jobs that are out there in Ohio, look at this, oil and gas, what's going on in the oil and gas industry. I mean, it is absolutely amazing that the jobs that are being created. You can go down there now and train and get a job after training that'll be in excess of $50,000 a year to start. That's a pretty good job for somebody who wants to train and be part of this oil and gas exploration. These are all good jobs. But we can't have the federal government holding it back. We have to make sure that we're growing forward with, especially that one. I mean, when I look at the energy, the opportunity for jobs right now in Ohio, with energy production, it's just unbelievable, the opportunities. Again, I'm not saying it's got to be safe, and it's got to be environmentally safe.
Thank you. That concludes our session on weak economic growth. We are now going to move to unemployment, and we will start off with the question. Please state your specific proposal for what should be done about the issue of unemployment. Cite data that indicates this proposal is likely to succeed, and explain the trade-offs you considered in recommending the action. And you have 4 minutes to respond.
All right. Here's the data that I'm going to give you that, I always look back at, we can get all kind of statistics, and I can take you and get you 5 different economists. In fact, I bring 10 economists in the room, and you probably get 10 different positions on certain things. Here's the best data. It comes from a guy who's done it before. All right? That's what I always said. You want to really make sure you understand how to create a job and how you get unemployment. Let's make sure that we have the guy who's willing to invest capital, who's willing to grow a business, which I did for 28 years, willing to move forward. That's the best statistic you can have. Because if he's willing to move forward, I remember the day when I was growing my business, I used to come in every morning and I'd say, you know what, we're doing good, I'm comfortable, the economy's going fine, we're going to do this. We're going to invest in this new business. We're going to add 10 people here. We're going to do 5 things. We're going to do this over here. I was the guy who was producing the jobs at the time. I was a job creator. So I understand what it means to sit in that chair. I got to tell you, if I sat in that chair today, which I don't, I sit in Congress, but if I sat in that chair, I have a lot of friends that still do, I'd come in every morning and say, how do I get by through this? How do I get through this day? How do I get through this week? What's the next thing going to hit me? What are my taxes going to be? So if we're ever going to fix our unemployment problem, we basically have to go back to the basics. We have to go back and talk to the people who employ people. I'm really not big on these statistics, and I'll tell you, we can, as I said, I can get you 5 economists to tell you one thing, 5 economists to tell you another thing. I'm a firm believer. That's why I've sat in over 100 meetings in the last 22 months like this, where people ask me questions. But you know what's more important, which I always like? I'd rather ask you questions, because you have the answers. I'm one of the guys that represent you. And I think that's the most important thing, to be able to listen to the people who are the ones that I represent and hear what they think should occur. Those are the facts, and those are the statistics I think are important. And that's why I go to business owners. I was at probably 6 different business owners these last 3 days. I want to hear what their concerns are. I want to hear what their problems are. I want to hear why they're not hiring. I want to hear what their problems are, and I want to hear how we can make them more comfortable in growing their business and adding employees. One thing I keep hearing, and I keep telling you, I keep going back to it, the good news is, for those that are employing, it's all the oil and gas industry. That's all I keep hearing. For those that aren't employing, the ones that aren't in the oil and gas business or aren't in a related business, it's not directly. Remember, there are a lot of indirect businesses. Now, here's a great example. I was in an RV place. Now, you would think RVs would not be going very well right now, the RV business, everybody. That business is booming. You know why? All the people coming in for oil and gas. That's what I just heard from an RV operator. So you see how it connects to the one business? It's amazing the other opportunities that occur just from one thing. Certainty and predictability, get that back into the workforce, get that back into the employers, and let's let them make the decisions to move forward. But at the same time, let's give that entrepreneurial spirit to the individual, the guy like me. I came from a family, my mother and dad, my dad was a coal railroad worker, my mother was a nurse, my dad lost his job early. I didn't have anything. But you know one thing I did have? I always believed in the American spirit and the American opportunity. And let's give that back to our children and our grandchildren. that's going to be another thing that's going to drive this economy moving forward.
We are now going to move into our committee's question and answer period. Remember, ask the question in 1 minute or less, and the congressman has 2 minutes to respond. Jim, I think you're first on the list.
By what standards will you measure your success and effectiveness of your plan to increase employment? And what do you consider a successful recovery rate, and what timeline?
Well, I would tell you this. We need to create more than 115,000 new jobs a month. And that's what we just heard occurred last month. So you statistically have to look. As a business owner, you have to look at what you've done and what the return is. The only way we're ever going to get the unemployment number really coming down, and we're going to affect those 20 million plus people that aren't working, is we've got to get more jobs out there. So the answer is, it's got to be more than 115,000 new jobs a month. We've got to get up there to the 250 to 300,000 new jobs a month. So our policies have to start showing that's occurring. I don't know why we would continue doing something every month and continue it and continue it and continue it when all we're going is 115,000 jobs a month. That's what we just heard occurred last couple of days. That's what we heard last month. 115,000 new jobs. You know, if you look at it, statistically, we need more than 250,000 new jobs. So the goal has to be, let's get to that 250,000. But that's not where we stop. Let's keep growing those numbers. So it's all about new jobs. And I think that's got to be our key to making sure that as we move forward, we're seeing more jobs, because the bigger the economy grows, the more jobs grow. Guess what starts to happen? People are employed, the economy grows faster, the deficit will start to come down because revenues will grow from all those people that are now being employed.
I didn't quite understand the timeline that you planned. When do you expect all this to?
Well, first thing we got to do is we got to get people in Washington working toward it. So the timeline is, I'd like to go back to Washington today and start that process. I'd like to start seeing change 30 days from now. But if you're asking me how fast do I think I can get it done, you know what the problem is? There's 434 other people that have to go along with it. And that's why I think the process for me has been to start a bipartisan group with 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats. I want to move that group to 50 to 100 and then get some things accomplished. But right now, I mean, I'd love to do it in 30 days, but I would be a politician if I told you that's going to happen. I mean, quite frankly, it's going to take much more time than that. It's going to take the ability to get people working together and moving forward. It's going to get the Senate having to start looking at some of these bills. And then once that happens, we can get that done.
Any other questions, Jim? Libby, you have our next question.
What policies do you support or have you proposed in order to reduce underemployment? And are there proven examples that this will work?
Well, again, I think the one that I brought to your attention, the one thing that I'm so proud of is this bipartisan group. You know, the bipartisan group started because an individual from the other side, John Carney, came up to me one day and said, "You look like a guy that wants to get something done. You look like a guy down here that's not concerned about politics. You want to get some things done." So we had a breakfast. He realized that when he and I met, I thought, this guy's just like me. So that group grew to 4, 6, 8, now 16. And one of the things I'm most proud of that came out of that group was that we have this bill that basically has now gotten through the payroll tax, it was part of the payroll tax extension, that says, when you talk about the underemployed, the people that need trained, this is an opportunity for states to step up and say, and here's how it really works. If the state first waivers it and gets it approved, then what they can do is they can turn these dollars into training money. So what happens is, if you're unemployed and you go to a new company to get a job, and they agree to train you, they pay you. The way it was set up, they had to pay you, in our bill, more than 110% of what you were making on unemployment to train you. At the same time, so you get paid, you're in the labor force, you're working, that 90% of what they were getting on unemployment goes to up to 90%, it could be less, goes to the employer to help them subsidize the training. Now, if you think about that, that's such a simple process. Who wins? The unemployed wins because now he has a job, he or she. What's even better is that unemployed person not only has a job, they're being trained. The company's training them and getting some subsidy, which is already going out anyway, and at the same time the government's saving at least 10%, if not more. Those are the kind of policies that I think can work. Those are the kind of things that I'm going to continue to push for. Things that are smart, and then we can see the return. Now, quite frankly, if we do that policy, and again, Texas is the only one that's waived it, so ask for the waiver. If we do that, I'm the type of person that wants to see how it works later. And if it doesn't work, I'd be the first one to come to you and say, didn't work, we got to do something different.
Libby, do you have any other clarifying questions? Mike, you're next.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Which criteria will determine which plan you will choose to achieve short and long-term employment growth?
Any plan that brings certainty and predictability to the marketplace as quickly as possible would be something that I believe would be my short term. Remember, there's a lot of opportunities for that, but I think that if you want to know what I believe would be a good short term to get economic growth, I keep going back to certainty and predictability. We all know right now, no one in this room has any certainty and predictability of what tax rates are going to be, what regulatory policy is going to be, what health care costs are going to be. Nobody in this room can tell us what that's going to be. We know one thing: if nothing happens, they're going up. Taxes are going up, health care costs are going up, regulatory burden's going up if we do nothing. So short term, we got to make sure certainty and predictability is established, and that's why I believe, I'm a firm believer, we need to extend tax policy today. We got to reform it too. It gets back to where we got to drop the rates. We got to extend the current tax rates. We got to limit extra regulatory burden. And again, how do you do that? Put a criterion on it. No new regulation comes up until we get under 6% unemployment. I think that's a great idea. And then when it comes to health care costs, I mean, I am a firm believer that the number one problem in health care today is health care costs. And the President's health care plan did not take care of health care costs. It took care of some good things, but 85% of the problem is health care costs, and they are going through the roof. You know, I visited a business the other day, 62% increase in health care costs. I visited another business, 42% increase in health care costs. The lowest I've heard is 27%. I mean, these are problems, because if I'm a business owner and my health care costs are going up 27, 42, 62, whatever the number is, I'm going to sit back and say, whoa, I'm not doing anything. So that's short term. Long term, I can see that bell's coming. I want to see the statistics. I want to be able to see the statistics that I talked about that will continue to prove job growth is occurring.
Mike, your next question?
How has long-term unemployment affected our local community?
Well, look, one thing you get with me is somebody who's out in the local community every day I'm back. And by the way, I'm the first one out of Washington after we're done, and I'm usually the last one back in. And if you look at my schedule, I'm the last. I take the last flight in on the day I got to be there, and I take the first flight out on the day we got to get here, because I believe the best thing to do is get back here. You know, if I'm going to understand what's going on, I want to know what's going on here. And unemployment is affecting us locally. I mean, if you look at some of the people that are on unemployment, friends, family, neighbors, you see it. There's not one person probably in this room that hasn't been affected by a family member that hasn't lost their job or been are now underemployed. And I think those are the things we have to get back and understand those problems. But the best way to fix those problems gets back to the same thing. Jobs, jobs, jobs. We've got to make sure that job creation's occurring. And I know that sounds like a broken record, but there's nobody in Congress should go back with any other thought except how do we produce jobs? We could talk about policy all day, but if the policy doesn't produce jobs, why are we even talking about it? I mean, and that's the real key here. So it has affected us. And if we look around at the unemployment, it's still there. Now, thank goodness we have oil and gas. I mean, I keep bringing that up because that is the only driver in our state today. I mean, I've said this a lot in the last couple months because people say, boy, the state of Ohio is doing good. And I say, God bless the state of Ohio because we have the reserves underneath the ground. A lot of it's not the policy. A lot of it's because we have the opportunity and we're taking advantage of that opportunity. I mean, and that's what's really helping our unemployment come down. but the policies are still there. Just think if we had that and we had better policies coming out of Washington, I mean, this unemployment rate in Ohio could drop drastically.
Mike, any clarifying questions? All right, John, you have the next question.
How can Congress safely expand access to credit so that business can expand and create jobs?
Well, look, we had a major disaster in 2007, 2008. And the credit markets, we were extending, and it wasn't Congress extending credit. There was a lot of credit being extended that shouldn't have been extended. And a lot of people say, well, we didn't have enough regulations. I got to tell you, after 22 months, and I'm on financial services, and I'm part of the, so that's my committee, and we do a lot of oversight on Dodd-Frank. What I've learned is we had regulations back then, too. But let's face it, the regulators weren't doing their jobs in a lot of ways. You know what happens in the real world when you don't do your job? Okay. That doesn't happen in the government world. In the government world, when you don't do your job, you get more people. In the real world, when you don't do your job, you're either written up and told you have to fix it, or there's somebody else that replaces you in that job because you have to do your job. So there's no doubt there were some regulations that needed to be looked at and tweaked. But I got to tell you, if people were just doing their job, we wouldn't have had the collapse that we had in a lot of ways. That's come up in financial service meetings. These aren't things that Jim Renacci's talking about. C-SPAN, I mean, they televise all these things. I mean, it's great. The one thing I love about Congress is you can sit there and get the facts. You can listen to people. You can listen to economists. You can listen to bankers. You can listen. You can talk to the regulators. So we had some problems. Now, what Dodd-Frank did is it just came in and threw a blanket over everything, which is a problem. Because there's some good guys that weren't part of the problem. Small banks, credit unions, all these little guys, they did the right thing. It's the Wall Street banks that were a problem, and the people on Wall Street should be penalized for what they did. But let's not penalize the small banks. Let's not penalize the community banks. Let's not penalize the credit unions. Let's make sure they're able to continue to push credit through. At the same time, and I know I'm running out of time, I just passed a bill with Representative Ellison. He's a Democrat from Minnesota. Not passed a bill, pushed a bill out on the House. And it basically says, let's start looking at people who pay their rent on time, who pay their utilities on time. Let's make sure they're getting credit, because today they're the invisible credit. They are good credit people, but they're not getting the credit they need. Those are the kind of things we can do.
John, do you have a clarifying question for that before we move into the follow-up session? All right, so now we're going to open up the floor to questions from all the participants. And our guidelines for those questions: ask your question in under a minute, and the congressman has a minute to respond. Louise, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned American spirit. I think, how can we have continue with our American spirit when the jobs are being outsourced? People don't have the jobs they used to have. It's overseas. That's some impact on the American spirit. And how can we get those jobs back?
It's a great question. National Manufacturing Association, you can look at you can go into their website. You'll get, here's what the National Manufacturing Association says. People are going, jobs are moving overseas for two reasons. Excluding payroll. Now this is a key, because you got to remember what I'm saying here. Excluding payroll, it's 20% more expensive to do business in the United States of America. Excluding payroll. So remember, I'm taking payroll off the table. Where's the 20% number come from? We already talked about part of it. 10% is taxes. If the less tax rate is, if it's 25% is the next lowest tax rate, it's 10% cheaper to do business outside this country. 10% is regulations. So if we want to get jobs back here, let's take a look at that 20%. Let's get our tax rates competitive across the global market. Let's get our regulations to a point where we still have them. They're just not over excessive. And we now save 20%. I guarantee if you talk to the people that are taking jobs overseas, you talk to those companies, which I've done, they've said many a time, if we could save 20%, we'd be right back here. That's the first place to start.
Bruce, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything that you would propose to specifically further promote Ohio's oil and gas industry?
Well, here's the one thing I would promote. We should never send anybody from back to Washington who voted for cap and trade, because cap and trade does not promote our oil and gas industry in Ohio. So that's number one. I mean, if we have that resource, we need to use that resource effectively. And at the same time, we have to make sure that it's economically good, and it's also environmentally safe. If you put all those three things together, then we just need to promote it by making sure, look at what happened to natural gas prices. They've dropped down tremendously because of what we have here. In fact, there's some say that production has stopped because gas prices are too low. Look at what's done to all our home prices on gas. I mean, let's face it, a couple of years ago, we were paying a lot more money. Those are the kind of things we need to promote.
Bruce, do you have a follow-up or clarifying question? All right, we have time for a few more questions. Bonnie?
On underemployment, not all underemployed need trained. Some just need more hours or higher wages. How can Congress encourage employers to fully employ more workers?
What's interesting, and I just heard this, and I wish I could quote the site because I think it is important. You know, higher wage jobs are leaving, and the growth of jobs today are lower wage jobs. So, you know, you're talking about more wages. We got to promote more jobs. We got to promote more higher wage jobs. We've got to promote more creation of higher wage jobs. We've got to get training, because how do you get more education? I mean, if you look at the statistics, high school students, college students, people with master's degrees, as they go up the line, they get more dollars. But at the same time, so we have to promote a number of things. We've got to promote education, training. At the same time, we've got to bring the jobs here. I mean, I just told you about a job and I was just out on the oil rig. I mean, I got to tell you, one thing about Congress, one thing about me, is you're not seeing me sitting at a desk. I mean, I was on top of an oil rig just a few months ago to see what it was doing here in Ohio and whether it was safe, how they handle it, and the jobs of the three guys that were on top of that rig. You know, again, over $60,000. It's a pretty good wage, and they were trained.
Any further question, Bonnie?
Actually, I did. Just one more thing. Since college debt is so high and trades are more in demand, has your bipartisan group considered using these unemployment insurance training dollars for trade training, not just employer-specific training?
Got to remember, that's a great question. And trade training includes taking an individual, hiring them, and then sending them to trade training. So that talks about welders and all those individuals on trades, body shop mechanics, truck drivers. I mean, you know how many truck drivers we need? I mean, that is just a perfect example. That bipartisan group, we've talked about that. And here's what I've done. I've gone to the trucking companies and said, would this help you? Absolutely, it would help us. I've gone to the companies who have welders and said, if you give us that opportunity, we'll hire people and we'll send them to welding school. Because you got to remember, they're getting a percentage of what they're paying back from the government. So that also enhances their ability to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yeah, Congressman, you've mentioned several times certainty and predictability would help businesses to feel more comfortable and expand. And you've expressed your interest in extending the current tax cuts as part of your way that you would do that. But we all know that Congress is just a little bit fickle, and they can change their mind at any time. So, what specifically would you say would, with some certainty and in concrete terms, provide that certainty and predictability without just merely saying we're going to extend these forever, knowing that it can be repealed?
Well, at least if you extend them, you know, you're right. I mean, that's one of the interesting things, and you brought up a great point. We pass budgets every year, and people want to say, well, Jim Renacci passed this budget, which means he wants to do this, this, and this. Budgets can be changed every year. Budgets can be replaced every year. Budgets are just a guide. So when you hear somebody say, so-and-so supports the Paul Ryan budget, keep in mind, Paul Ryan budget is a 10-year budget that gets changed every year. So it's a great question. The problem is, we have to be able to look at each other in Congress and say, if I was back in my district and I was employing people, I would want to know what I have in my future for at least 5 years. At least 5 years. Because then I have some certainty and predictability. We can't give people predictability. Look, we can't get a highway bill passed. I mean, if you think about it, highway project takes 5, 10 years. We're extending it 6 months. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Every time I see that 10-second, I keep moving.
We have time for one more question. Dan?
Congressman Renacci, I appreciate and applaud your efforts to do the bipartisan and to form together with your associates on the other side of the aisle. And I also encourage and appreciate the fact that you recognize that jobs are the most critical factor in front of us today, that without jobs and without job creation in the 250,000 to 300,000 per month, we're never going to get back on this long road to recovery. You're only one person. I recognize that. You're one of 435 in your house, and then you have 100 people to convince, and then you have the guy in the White House. And I recognize what you were saying is that your committee of 8, you'd like to expand it to 100 and then to 200 and then to 435, 535, and get something done. What leadership skills, what can you do to get the focus and the attention of the rest of your group to focus on jobs?
Good point. And you know what? It's interesting because I got to tell you a little bit about how this bipartisan group formed. I mean, I told you that John Carney and I started it. John and I just started over breakfast. But here's what happened. We had another breakfast. John brought a couple people. I brought a couple people. They all started agreeing it was a jobs issue. And then on the House floor one day, I'll never forget this, a guy walks up to me and says, Congressman Renacci, I have a lot of respect for you. And I had no idea who he was. You got to remember, it's 435 people standing around. And I said, he said, I'd like to be a part of your group. And I go, well, and it was a long day. So I walked out. I said, sure, yeah, you can be part of the group. So I left. And I go back to my staff and I say, hey, we got another guy who wants to be part of the group. So they go, well, who was he? I go, I don't know. So I started going through my book and I said, here he is. And they go, he doesn't want to be part of your group. I go, why not? Well, it was Peter Welsh. He's a progressive liberal from Vermont. I said, well, he wants to be part of our group, but he's going to be part of our group. Long story short, he becomes part of the group. He sits next to me. I'll never forget this at that breakfast. And he says, you know what, Jim Renacci and I may disagree on how to get there, but we do agree that jobs and the economy and getting people back to work are important. That was probably one of the best days I had in Congress. I think that can continue. We actually stopped the growth of our group at 16 because we thought it was getting out, just too many people. And then what really stopped the group after 16 was when I got in this election. That's the problem with elections every 2 years. The leadership from the other side started to slow the process down.
All right, so we have concluded the second round of questions and answers on our 3 issues, and we're about to move into the third round, and those questions are associated with the federal debt and deficit. So if everybody would like to get their notes out.
It's interesting, when you first said we're coming to a conclusion, I thought, that's 75 minutes went pretty quick. So I looked at my watch, I said, it can't have 75 minutes over with already.
So we're going to follow the same guidelines for the opening question and the committee questions and follow-up questions. And we are going to start with the question of, please state your specific proposal for what should be done about the issue of the federal debt and deficit, cite data that indicates this proposal is likely to succeed, and explain the trade-offs you considered in recommending this action.
Well, keep in mind, and I forget what general said this, but the greatest threat to our country is our federal deficit. Let's face it. As our deficit continues to grow, it's going to be a problem. And we can talk about tax increases on the wealthy and all those things, but those tax increases on the wealthy are not going to fix the debt. The debt has to be fixed by fixing the bucket. And I always give this example to everyone. If I held up a bucket and it had a bunch of holes in it, and the water was just leaking out of all those holes, let's say there were 20 holes, and you gave me the answer, well, let's throw some more water in it, I'd ask you the question, how did we just fix the problem? Because the problem is the bucket's leaking bad. So the answer to the deficit is not by throwing more water in it, it's about fixing the bucket. And if we can fix the bucket, we can fix the deficit. And you can't fix the bucket by throwing more water in it. Nobody should be asked to throw more water in that bucket. Nobody should be asked to throw more water in that bucket until the bucket's fixed. So we need to make sure the bucket's fixed. Now when I say that about the bucket, that's the deficit. That's the spending. Look, we don't have a We don't have a revenue problem in Washington. We have a spending problem in Washington. One thing that I can tell you in going to Washington, I was able, the first thing I did was I sat down with a CBO in the general accounting office, and I said, show me the books. Show me what's going on. Show me the balance sheet. And I don't know if anybody in here is a business person that's ever looked at a balance sheet, but you know that the federal government doesn't have a balance sheet? Shame on federal government. There is no balance sheet. How could you ever get anything done without a balance sheet? Now, this is coming from somebody who, you know, I might not be the smartest guy in the world, and I built a business, but I got to tell you, the first thing I ever looked at was the balance sheet. We need to know what's going on, because a balance sheet will tell you what your true debts are. It'll tell you where you're going. It'll tell you where you're at a certain point in time. The problem is, you hear $16 trillion is our debt, but when I sat around with the people in the general accounting office, I said, well, how about unrecorded liabilities? How about pension costs that aren't on the books? Where are all those numbers? They're not there. So when you do hear people say that the deficit could be greater than 16 trillion, it clearly could be. And there's not anybody in Washington can tell you what it is, which is kind of scary, what the number really is. One of the things I asked for, and I'll just tell you about debts and deficits, because it's about spending, I asked the question, well, let's do something simple, because if you go to my background, you'll see that I was a CPA. I took over a lot of troubled businesses. I turned them around. How did I turn them around? Well, I looked at little things. First thing I always looked at was travel. We hear about all this travel. We've got the president traveling all over the place. We've got members of Congress, both sides traveling all over the place. Quite frankly, what's our cost of travel? Wouldn't that be an interesting number to find out? 22 months later, I still don't have that number, because it's almost impossible to find, because we have a system that we can't get those numbers. Now, in the business world, you could have 30, 40, 50 companies. You could push a button, consolidate your numbers, and you can know exactly what your travel is by location. You realize how difficult that is in Washington? There's got to be a reason for that, right? That's what I thought. People in Washington don't want us to know. And that's what troubles me. And I'm going to work really hard to make sure we get those answers. But that's, when it comes to debt and deficit, we need to be able to look at those things and fix the bucket. I can go into details of why the bucket's leaking. I don't have time, but we need to fix the bucket.
Great. Our first question is from Wanda.
Congressman Renacci, will your policies be substantial enough to make a significant difference in the deficit and debt?
Well, the answer to that is we didn't get into this problem in 1 year. We got into it in a lot of years, and we're going to take us a lot of years to get out of it. People might complain about the House budget, the Ryan budget, whatever you want to call it. It gets us out of it in about 25 years. Now, people don't realize that, because everybody wants it to get done today. The problem is the deficit is over $1 trillion a year. If you think we have problems in our economy today, take $1 trillion out of the economy like that to fix it, and we could put our economy in a disastrous position. So we got ourselves in this position over years. It's going to take us a while to get out of it. One of the things we have to look at all the drivers. What is driving debt and deficit? Well, what's driving debt and deficit is some of it is the entitlement programs. We have to look at it, folks. A lot of politicians don't want to talk about it, but I think as Americans we have to talk about it. We have to look at the programs that are driving debt and deficit. Almost 65% of our spending is in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest, and wars. You know, all we're doing, when you hear us cutting things, we're cutting all the other stuff. We're cutting that 30%. We've got to get into the big picture and start looking at it. We don't have to eliminate it. We have to make it safe. We have to make sure that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are around forever. We have to make sure it's solvent. But if we don't do anything, if we do nothing, Medicare is insolvent in 10 years. And see, politicians have allowed this to occur because they don't want to talk about it. That's why I told you I'm not a politician. I want to fix it for our children and our grandchildren. I want Medicare to be around. I want it to be solvent. I want Medicaid to be around. I want it to be solvent. I want Social Security to be around. I want it to be solvent. We have to be able to look at the drivers, and it's going to take time.
Wanda, do you have any clarifying questions?
My only comment is that people know in their own home they have to stay within their means or they're going to be in trouble. how do we get some of these people to listen to us? You're the only person we have any touch with down in that government. Can we write letters to the president all the time, or?
I think you need to hold your elected officials accountable. I think you need to make sure that your elected officials are willing to come to meetings like this and talk to you. I think you have to have your elected officials willing to do town halls, like I've done numerous times over the last 2 years, and listen to your concerns. At the same time, it's just not up to your elected officials, so I got to tell you. One thing I've learned in the last 22 months is I've had some very interesting conversations at the dinner table, at the lunch table, at the Thanksgiving table, at every table. I've had conversations with my family that have put us at odds, my brother-in-law, my sister. But you know what? If we don't have those conversations, we're never going to get this taken care of. That's why it is so great that you're all here, because you have to be willing to leave this room and go out and talk to other people. Otherwise, it just stays here. But these are issues. We have to talk about them. We have to realize what the drivers of the debt are. We have to realize what's causing the bucket to have all the leaks in it. And we have to be willing to look at them and fix them.
Janet, you have our next question.
Congressman Renacci, in order to keep debt below 60% GDP, do you propose to increase revenue through tax increases, to reduce spending, or both? Please be specific.
We talked a little bit about that already, and I'll go back over it. You got to remember that if we're already in a situation where we're not competitive in the global market, raising taxes makes us less competitive. And somebody would say, well, just raise it on the higher individuals. Well, you got to remember, if the higher individuals are the ones who pay their taxes, their business taxes on their personal tax returns, then that makes them less competitive. At the same time, that's what people don't want to talk about. You want to get a politician in a back and forth discussion, start asking them about, okay, we raise taxes, we bring in X amount of dollars. But at the same time, how does it affect the productivity of jobs and job creators? And let's balance both of those. The question is, it used to be easy, we'll just raise taxes. But if we're going to raise taxes on the business owners, the people who produce jobs, the people already are going overseas because it's 20% cheaper to go overseas. If we continue to raise taxes on them, we have a problem. That's why I said our government does not have a revenue problem, it has a spending problem. If I were able to take you to Washington, man, I invite all of you anytime, one day, and show you the curve, you would see that the revenue curve has gone up pretty reasonable over the last couple hundred years. The expense curve has shot up like the start of a roller coaster. And until you get that, now again, I'm a guy who's gone into some very troubled businesses, until you get that expense curve down, until you get that bucket fixed, nobody should be putting any more water in the bucket, because all you're doing is asking somebody else to waste money. We need to fix the bucket first, and I think that's so important.
Thank you.
Chuck?
In order to get the significant cuts needed, which programs would you cut and who would be most affected?
Well, I think we need to look at this, and this would be easy. We need to look around the room and decide who believes we should spend money on certain programs. It's just not my decision, it's all your decisions. I represent you. What programs should be cut when you know that we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar to continue to go forward? So the question is, which programs do you think we should cut? Now, there's some people that would chastise, you heard Governor Romney talk about NPR. Look, a lot of other TV stations, and again, I'm okay with NPR. I think they do great programming. But the question is, do we continue funding the small, we fund a small percentage of it, do we continue to do that when we know we're borrowing 40 cents on the dollar? There's some people that chastise other cuts we make. The question is, I think we need, as all of us need to look around the room and say, which cuts do we believe we should make and which cuts do we? Here's what I said to my brother-in-law one day. My brother-in-law called me about one of the cuts, and I said to him, did you contribute to that program? He said, no. Now, my brother-in-law is a doctor down in Texas. And I said, so you don't contribute to it, but you want me to make everybody else in this room contribute to it. That's how you answer that question. I mean, when you start to ask that question, and you go out and you talk to people, you get a better understanding. It's easy to say, well, you're cutting that program, or you're doing this. Again, it's pretty simple. We need to look at programs and decide which ones we're going to cut, knowing that we're borrowing 40 cents on the dollar. And that's why you've already seen some of the votes I've taken. I mean, I've gotten chastised. We have made cuts, the most substantial cuts in the last 25 years. Our budget has made cuts. People don't like them. I mean, you know how many people come into my office and say, we think that Alzheimer's, you need to spend more money on Alzheimer's, and we think you need to spend more money on this program, and we need to spend more money on that program. These are all great programs. These are all programs we need to look at, but we don't have the money. So we have to take a look at them and decide which ones we should borrow and which ones we shouldn't.
All right, Dan?
Congressman Renacci, I'm going to paraphrase this question if I may, because basically Chuck asked you what cuts you would make, and essentially you said that we need to decide what cuts. You've been in the office for 2 years. You spent the last 6 months out talking to your constituents. Part of the 16th district is new to you, but you've talked to a lot of people. Based on your discussions, what programs will you cut?
Well, I think what they're saying is we need to make sure Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are solvent. So we need to look at those, and to make sure they're solvent, we need to do some reforming of those. Some people will call it cuts. I don't call it cuts. I call it reform. We need to make sure Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are around forever. So there are a lot of people out there that are saying, you know, that's something we need to take a look at. We need to look at our costs in the defense. I agree with that. But I got to tell you, we can't make our military go back to 1940 standards. We need to make sure our military is the strongest in the world. So we need to look at it, but we need to cut out waste. And there is waste. And if I had more time, I could tell you waste, because in the private sector, I found waste in the military. But it wasn't I don't think we cut pay. I don't think we cut equipment. If we're going to send people to war, we got to make sure they have the equipment, they've got the ability to protect themselves, and they got all the equipment they need. At the same time, when they come back, we got to take care of them. We got to make sure they have jobs, and we got to make sure that ultimately their benefits are there, because they've done a service for us. We got to make sure we protect them. I'm a strong supporter of the military. So now we're going to save and make sure that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid is around forever. We're going to make sure that the war spending is adequate. We got interest. Guess what? That's another number in there. And interest, it is what it is. Thank goodness it's only 1%. By the way, just think if we went to market rate interest. I mean, right now the interest rate's between 1% and 2%. If it went up to market rate of 5 or 6, for every increase in 1%, they say there's $1 trillion added to the deficit. That's a scary number to think about. So now we've looked at all that. Let's start looking at the rest of it, and that's where we have to start going around. So when I talk to people, they say, hey, we got to start cutting out programs that we got to make sure our elderly are taken care of. We got to make sure our military. We got to start looking at all those other programs, which includes, you know, what he just talked about, NPR and cuts across the board, and you know, funding of some of these programs that aren't really part of those issues I just talked about. EPA, we voted to cut 30% off of EPA's budget. I mean, I get applauded for that in some rooms, and I get booed for that in others. That's the one thing about being in Congress.
Thank you.
Bruce, do you have a question?
I do. I have a kind of a worst case scenario question for you about the debt. The American Enterprise Institute believes that if Congress fails to make significant cuts now, America will be forced to choose from one of the following: to dramatically raise taxes on future generations, to inflate our currency to cover the debt, or to just flat out refuse to pay the debt. If you were faced with only these choices, which would you pursue and why?
What were the three again?
Dramatically increase taxes, inflate the currency, or just refuse to pay the debt.
I'm a firm believer, and look, in my lifetime, I've been faced with a lot of challenges, and I've been told that there are only 3 answers, but there's always a fourth. And the fourth answer is really to make sure that we protect our country, we protect our economy, we move forward in a way. I've already made one of the toughest decisions, which was to pass a budget that some people will chastise, some people will applaud, but at least it turns things around. And now that's one organization that believes that if we don't do things quickly, the answer is, what is quickly? I'm a firm believer And if you look at my background, which is what I think, the thing I appreciate most about being in Congress is that I've got the background to be able to talk with people about issues. Because when you talk about companies that are heading into bankruptcy, you know, that's the first thing that you're sitting around a room, and a person will say, you know what, the company's going to bankruptcy, we just got to default on the debt. No, we don't. We got to fix the problem. We got to fix the holes. And if we fix the holes, the creditors will give us time. And if we do things right, the employees will still be here. So I'm a firm believer you can't take one organization's opinion. I believe that we have to put the country in the right direction. We have to pivot our country and our economy in the right direction. We're not there now. We're not going in the right direction. And my opinion is, you know, the budget plan that we passed, you can call it the Ryan plan, you can call it the House plan, call it any plan you want. It pivots us in the right direction over the next 25 years. It would have, if we would have passed it in both houses and the president was signed off on it, it would have saved our credit, you know, our credit rating, and many people say. I think those are the things we have to do. Look, we didn't get here in a year or two, and we're never going to get out of this in a year or two. But I got to tell you, if we don't turn the course and pivot and go in the right direction, we are going to have problems where those choices we're not even going to have, they're going to occur.
Dan, do you have a follow-up question, or do you want to hold it? Okay.
Now we want to ask a process question. It's related to the previous topic. Based on the past failures of Congress, I mean, they've had budget bills and laws since 1917, the ceiling on the federal debt, the Graham-Rudman, the pay-as-you-go, the Budget Control Act, and now we have a fiscal cliff that we seem to approach and pass over every time. Based on how will you help bring Congress together to actually get these proposals implemented without repeating the past of watching our elected officials ignore their own rules?
It's a great question. Let me explain something. People go to Washington because they need a career. People go to Washington because they need a job. Jim Renacci is going to Washington to fix things. And I think that's the most important thing you get with Jim Renacci. Jim Renacci is going there because he believes that he needs to fix things. Now, how do you fix things? You just can't go down there and say, I'm going to drive my stake in the ground and this is all I'm going to do, and stand around me or go away from me. That's not going to work either. What Jim Renacci did within 4 months of being there is co-sponsored a bipartisan group who believes we need to make a difference. And that's what I think that's so important. That is a great, I've only been there 21 months, and do you believe that we were able to put a 16-member group, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats together, and we meet all the time. Now here's the other thing that we just did, and by the way, we've had people come in and talk to the group. That group has to grow. I realize 16 isn't enough to get to the 435. That group could grow tomorrow to 50 if we let it. That group could grow to 100 if we let it. But we've got to put some substance behind it. So the one thing that we did in one of our last meetings is we had a number of outside think tanks come in. Because a lot of times you get together and you say, well, this group, you know, of Congress people, they've made this decision. But they don't have that think tanks behind them. They don't have the resources behind them to defend and support their idea. So the one thing that happened in one of our recent meetings was that we had a think tank come in and said, you know what we'll do? We appreciate the direction you're going. We'll come in and we'll do all the background studies for any decision you make, which is what you're asking. You know, how do we move forward? And we'll do it over 10 years, 20 years, and guess what? We'll fund it ourselves, and it'll be an independent, nonpartisan group to support your bipartisan group. That's step 2. That's what I believe we need to do in Congress next. Take that group, move it from 16 to 20 to 50, and then bring a nonpartisan group in behind to support our ideas. Then all of a sudden let the American people hear about it. Because once the American people hear about it, they're going to say, you know what, I like what that group's doing, and they got support. That's the direction I think we need to take.
We have one more question in this period. Wanda?
I believe you've pretty well answered it. But being an incumbent, what have you done that would demonstrate your ability to accomplish what you just told us?
Well, yeah, I would go back to that right there. You got to remember, being an incumbent, the first 2 years, you really got to get to know the system. I mean, can you imagine you get your first job? You got to go in. You got to know where to go. You got to know how to get to the house. You got to go know. You got to establish yourself. The other thing I did, I mean, I'm the vice chair of the the finance subcommittee on banking and financial institutions. to be a freshman and to move to vice chair, you know how I had to do that? I had to go to my colleagues and give them my resume and tell them that my background was stronger than people who had been there 8, 10, 12 years. It's not easy to do, but I did it. So I'm now the vice chair of the Banking and Finance Committee. That doesn't happen very often, but that's what I got to do. You got to fight for things. One thing I learned in Washington, you got to fight. You got to be willing to get in there and fight. You got to be willing to get in there, but you can't just fight with political statements. You know, that's the problem with Washington. In Washington, you get so many political statements. I mean, sometimes I stand beside Republicans and Democrats, and I just don't want to hear anymore. Both sides. I mean, both sides. They just talk and talk and talk political rhetoric. I talked about experience. I talked about background, and I got named to vice chair. I think that's important. My goal is not to be there for a career. My goal is not to be there for a lifetime. My goal is to get things done, get things accomplished, and then to move on. I've said that about my past history. You know, I became mayor of Wadsworth not because I wanted mayor on my resume. It was because the city was bleeding $2 million of debt, and I said I wanted to turn it around. And when I did, I left. And that's what I really think we need to accomplish. We need to be able to go in there and be willing to make the tough decisions, stand up for all of you, because it's not about me, it's about you. Stand up for you, make the tough decisions, even if you're going against your party, and even if you're going against where things the way they appear to be going, what's right for all of you. But at the same time, don't drive that sword in and say, this is where I'm at and this is the only place I'm going. So.
All right, we have a real short amount of time to ask some follow-up questions from members from the whole group. Do we have any ready? John?
Your bipartisan group that put together the bill that says no new regs until we get 6% on unemployment, where is that bill?
That did not come out of the bipartisan group. I want to make sure that came out of, that is a bill that passed in the House. That came out of that came onto the floor. That bill is just sitting over in the Senate and not being taken up.
Becky?
Many people like myself, working hard, working 2-3 jobs, are on a wage freeze or taking jobs, supplemental jobs, at much less the amount they're currently receiving. Is Congress thinking about doing that, putting themselves on a wage freeze or a wage reduction to help things?
It's a good question. One of the things we've done in the House is we've cut our own budgets by, first time I think it was 6 and the second time it was 5, so we've cut our own budgets by 11%. And I think we need to do that. I think that was the first statement. The problem is the Senate hasn't taken that up either. Those are the kind of things that are problematic. But that's why I said, yes, we should. One of the things I'm very proud of is, you know, in Washington, you're given a certain allowance, and you have to live within that allowance. I sent back to the Treasury, and don't hold me on this number, it was reported once before, I think it was 280,000 I sent back. My budget's 1.3, somewhere around there. I sent 280,000 back. Start to look at your Congress people and determine how much they're sending back, because that's how much they run efficiently. That's probably one of the biggest numbers sent back, which shows you, I believe, I need to live within the same reins that all of us. I want to, look, again, you can look at my background. I mean, it's pretty simple. I grew up in a poor family. I understand what you're saying.
That concludes our third round of questioning. Let's thank Congressman Renacci for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's it?
Great. And we'll take your back out in the hall.